Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. The true cost of war, lives tragically lost and battles fought, cannot be quantified, of course. But there is another side to war, one that often flies under the radar. It is the economic cost. And in the case of the United States, the post-9/11 wars have created a vast, complex web of financial burdens that continue to grow even long after the troops have come home. Today, we're going to walk through what those economic costs really are, how they show up in everyday budgets, and why the price of war doesn't stop when the fighting ends. Let's start with the basics. Since 2001, the United States has spent and obligated around $8 trillion with a T, $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. That includes the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as military operations in Syria, support operations for allies, and broader counterterrorism efforts through the Department of Homeland Security. This isn't just about the Department of Defense. That $8 trillion number that I just mentioned includes over $2 trillion in future obligations to care for veterans, more than $1 trillion in interest payments on war-related debt, and more than $1 trillion in funding for Homeland Security efforts within the United States. What's unique about these wars is how they were funded. Instead of raising taxes or issuing war bonds, like the United States did in previous wars, the post-9/11 wars were paid for almost entirely through borrowing. In other words, they were credit card wars. To wage a war, America takes on more debt. Now, with the national debt about to hit $37 trillion and interest to service that debt now being more than $1 trillion per year, is it truly wise to get further in debt to wage more wars? One of the benefits of waging wars by borrowing money is that these wars are largely invisible to the average taxpayer in the United States of America. But pushing those costs into the future means someone still has to pay, and that someone are future generations, your children. As interest builds up on the borrowed money, the cost of the war keeps rising, even though the combat itself has ended. By 2030, the United States is expected to have paid over $2 trillion just in interest on war debt, which equals the direct costs of the actual military operations themselves. Now let's zoom in on one major long-term cost: veterans care. Veterans of these wars will need ongoing physical and mental health care, and the price tag for that is projected to reach between $2.2 and $2.5 trillion by 2050. And here's the thing, that care doesn't really peak until decades after the war ends. As veterans age, their needs increase, and without sufficient budget planning, the United States risks shortchanging its promises to those who served. Between 2001 and 2020, spending on veterans doubled as a share of the federal budget, from 2.4% to 4.9%, even as the number of living veterans dropped. This tells us just how expensive long-term veteran care is. Another layer to the story is the Department of Homeland Security. Created after 9/11, DHS is the largest organization of the United States government since World War II. It now includes agencies like Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Transportation Security Administration. Since 2003, federal spending for Homeland Security has topped $1.1 trillion. That number doesn't even account for what state and local governments have spent on related security initiatives, those costs that are often hidden in police and emergency budgets. Let's not forget reconstruction costs either. When military action damages infrastructure, such as roads, power lines, hospitals, someone has to pay to rebuild. Traditionally, that has been the job of the State Department or USAID, but increasingly, the military itself is taking over reconstruction efforts. And what's more, much of that funding, and we're talking about billions of dollars here, has shifted towards security assistance, building up foreign police and building up foreign military units, rather than civilian institutions or infrastructure. This too becomes a long-term financial commitment, not just a one-time expense. As the United States shifts its national security focus away from terrorism toward great power competition with China and Russia, we're seeing military spending continue to climb. For example, in the year following October 2023, the United States spent nearly $18 billion to support Israel's war on Gaza, plus another $4.9 billion on related U.S. operations in the Middle East. As President Trump is preparing to join Israel's war of aggression against Iran, we ought to understand that it will come with a price tag for every person in the United States. Despite claims of new threats, it is important to note that the United States still spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. In fact, the United States spends 2 to 3 times more than China, even after adjusting for labor and purchasing power differences. And what about Russia's military budget, you might ask? Well, it's actually less than 1/10 of the United States defense budget, despite its large nuclear arsenal. The financial burden of war also stretches to America's allies. The United Kingdom and Canada, for instance, spent roughly half as much on Afghanistan as the United States did, relative to their military budgets. But when it comes to foreign aid, the United States actually gave less than the UK and about the same as Germany and Canada relative to GDP. In other words, the United States spent more on fighting and less on rebuilding. So what can we take away from all of this information that I just shared with you? War is expensive. The ultimate price is paid with human lives, military and civilian lives. But the economic cost isn't just what's spent during combat, it's what comes after and for how long. Veterans' healthcare, debt interest, homeland security, and reconstruction, all of these costs extend for decades and sometimes lifetimes. And because these wars were funded with borrowed money, the United States is still paying for them today. You're still paying for them today, and you will be for many years to come. Being on the precipice of a possible war with Iran, a completely and utterly devastating conflict that may turn nuclear, there's a lot to think about, and we must do everything possible to prevent it. If we want to have an honest conversation about military interventions, we have to include the economic impact, not just in billions or trillions, but in the opportunity costs, in the communities affected, and in the long-term strain on future budgets. There is a great quote that puts in perspective what I just said, that puts in perspective the economic impact of waging wars on borrowed money. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. Please remember to show your support, like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something from it. Support my work on Substack and Patreon. You'll find those linked in the description below. And I look forward to seeing you back here soon. Bye for now.